Every truth hides a darker secret.
There are stories in this world that return again and again. They gather new details, shift geography and languages, yet each time they sound the same. A statue wept. A drop formed in the corner of the eye, slid slowly down the cheek, and left a dark streak. Someone caught the glint, someone pressed their fingers to it, and someone ran to fetch a priest. We're used to thinking of stone as something motionless and impassive. Yet when it comes to religious images, statues, and icons, any change to the surface is read as a sign. For some, it is God's answer to prayer. For others, a mistake of perception, a quirk of humidity, or a deft hoax. Today, calmly and without chasing a sensation, we'll look into the phenomenon of weeping statues. We'll revisit several key episodes of the 20th and 21st centuries. We'll see what analyses were carried out, what laboratories found, how church commissions and journalists responded. And we'll ask a few simple questions. What exactly are we seeing when we think we see tears? How do materials, plaster, marble, concrete, wood behave in an ordinary apartment or a small chapel? And why can collective perception amplify the slightest effects to the scale of a miracle? Our starting point is Sicily, the summer of 1953, an event many consider the beginning of the modern history of weeping images. An ordinary young family, an unremarkable little room, a modest bas-relief of the Virgin Mary on the wall, and a chain of reactions that includes genuine astonishment, confusion, and a desire to give meaning to what happened. Before we begin, a word about method. We are not trying to prove the supernatural, nor to disprove it. We record facts, and we mark where the information is verifiable and where it rests on eyewitness memories. Wherever possible, we turn to known physical mechanisms, condensation, capillarity, the migration of fluids in porous materials, and we keep psychology in mind. The way expectations and context shape what we notice and how we explain it. Take a breath. Imagine a warm afternoon, shutters closed, a square of sunlight on the floor. On the wall, a pale plaster face. Silence. And then, a wet gleam appears in the eye. A drop clings to the lower lid and slowly trails downward. What lies before us is not a myth lost in the mists of time, but a concrete point on the map, a specific date, and real people. That is where we're headed, to examine everything calmly, step by step. A young couple moves into a new apartment. Their belongings are simple: a bed, a narrow wardrobe, a table, a few chairs, a wall clock. As a wedding gift, they receive a relief image of the Virgin Mary, a plaster medallion icon in a light frame. These were sold everywhere at markets and in church shops. The image is neither old nor rare. They hang it in the room so it can be seen from any angle. For the next few weeks, life goes on as usual. Work, household chores, the occasional visitor. One day the wife notices a damp glimmer on the face of the relief. At first, she thinks it's dust, then condensation. Perhaps after cooking the room grew warm while the wall stayed cool. She wipes the statue's face with a clean cloth. Sometime later the glimmer returns. Now it isn't just moisture. A drop hangs at the corner of the eye. A thin track runs down the cheek. From this moment, the public gaze switches on. The husband calls a neighbor. She calls two more. Someone alerts the priest from the nearest parish. The room quickly stops being private. A stream forms. People come and go, peer closely, whisper, cross themselves, argue. Someone asks permission to touch it. Someone presses a handkerchief to it, hoping to keep the cloth as a memento. The priest's reaction is cautious. He doesn't proclaim a miracle or summon reporters. He suggests clearing out unnecessary people, airing the room, wiping the surface, and seeing whether the phenomenon recurs. It does. Several times throughout the day, a damp sheen is visible again on the face. In the evenings, when the apartment cools, the drop forms faster. During the day, it appears more slowly or disappears altogether. In the next neighborhood, shopkeepers are already talking. People habitually ask for specifics: which building, whose apartment, how large the relief is, how quickly the tears flow. The next day, journalists arrive. They document events as they know how. Short notes, photographs, headlines that spread across Sicily at once. The text begins to include words like inexplicable, prayers, pilgrims. When the first car pulls up with strangers from the mainland, the family realizes the event has outgrown their courtyard. In parallel, practical questions arise. Who has access to the image? Has its position been changed? What about the wall? Does it stay dry, or does it dampen after rain? Are there water pipes nearby that could create local cooling? Were any oils or cleaning fluids used in the apartment that could have gotten onto the surface of the relief and soaked into its pores? Together with a few helpers, the priest proposes to systematize the observation. Secure the relief, restrict access, remove anything superfluous from the room, note the times when moisture appears and disappears. They invite a doctor and a pharmacist, people practiced in handling samples. Later, representatives of the diocese will join them. It's clarified. If the drops are collected on a sterile swab and delivered to a laboratory, their composition can be determined. That won't define a miracle, but it will show what we are dealing with physically. Days pass, the rhythm repeats. In the morning, less moisture. Toward evening, more. At times, not only a clear drop appears on the surface, but also the faintest tint. By candlelight, it's easy to take it for blood-tinged. In daylight, it more often proves to be a shadow cast by an irregularity. But among dozens of witnesses, there will always be those who say, "I saw red tears." And those testimonies will take on a life of their own, regardless of what the analyses show. In the end, what matters isn't how many people came, but what remains on paper. Dates, air temperature, humidity, the timing of observations, the fact of how samples were collected and transported. That is the foundation on which further discussion is built. When the first wave of emotion subsides, the most unremarkable and the most important phase begins. The routine of observation. A log is kept: date, time, room temperature, air humidity, notes on the appearance of the relief surface. If a drop can be collected, the method of sampling and storage conditions are recorded. It seems tedious, but this is exactly what separates a historical anecdote from an event that can be taken seriously. The first analyses show that the collected liquid contains water and a small amount of dissolved salts. Protein tests yield a faintly positive reaction. Not enough to declare human tears, but enough to say the composition does not resemble ordinary tap water. Those hungry for sensation rush to conclusions. The cautious stay within the phrase "similar in composition." The difference between the two approaches lies in a single word, but it is a crucial one. At the same time, questions arise about the material of the relief itself. Plaster is porous. It can absorb and release moisture like a sponge. If the surface was ever treated with oil or a perfumed substance, it could have settled into the pores. With changes in temperature and humidity, such materials can migrate, appearing on the surface as a thin film. Pores filled with traces of fat can create the illusion of transparent moisture. And when light strikes at an angle, the human eye perceives a droplet. But in the story of Syracuse, there are details that make one pause. First, the phenomenon was witnessed by dozens of people, under different lighting, at different times of day. Second, not all drops looked alike. Sometimes it was a mere glimmer, sometimes a cloudy film, and sometimes a distinct streak down the cheek. Moreover, several doctors and pharmacists who were invited to the site personally observed the phenomenon. Their signatures appear in the observation protocols. A week later, the diocese formally establishes a commission. It includes representatives of the church, medicine, and chemistry. They visit the house, examine the room, and take measurements. The relief is carefully removed from the wall to check whether a water pipe runs behind it or if condensation is forming on the reverse side. Nothing of the sort is found. The wall is dry, the plaster intact. Once the relief is reattached, the phenomenon continues. It is recorded in the protocol as having no visible explanation under current conditions. When the samples reach the laboratory, the analysis is repeated under stricter procedures. Microscopy and chromatography are used along with pH determination. The result, the liquid's composition is indeed close to that of human tears. Water, trace proteins, salts, and small amounts of lipids. Based on this, the report adopts the phrasing compatible with the composition of human lacrimal fluid. For newspapers and the faithful, that is more than enough for the word miracle to become firmly attached to the event. The Church, however, is cautious. Official recognition of miracles requires years of verification. The local bishop states, "We testify to a fact that has no simple explanation." The Church refrains from hasty conclusions. These words do little to stop the stream of pilgrims. Within weeks, lines form outside the house. Local authorities must regulate traffic, and on the next street, a shop opens selling postcards and candles. For the family, it becomes a trial. People arrive with pleas, bringing sick children, notes, bottles of water to be blessed with the miraculous tears. Neighbors complain about noise and the smell of wax. Newspapers publish conflicting stories. Some call for the exposure of fraud. Others urge not to insult the faith of ordinary people. Meanwhile, the Commission continues its work. The phenomenon proves unstable. Some days the surface remains dry, then suddenly droplets appear. Some members lean toward the explanation of condensation. Others point out that temperature and humidity were measured, and they don't account for the exact timing of the tear's appearance. After a month, the relief is moved to a church to observe the phenomenon in more controlled conditions. There, beneath the dome, in the cool and constant air, the moisture appears again. For many, that becomes the decisive argument. For skeptics, another coincidence. For believers, confirmation of sanctity. From that moment, the story enters the international press. And although hundreds of similar cases will later be reported across the world, it is Syracuse that becomes the symbol of the weeping statues. Not because anything was proven, but because for the first time, the phenomenon was documented with such care and honesty. Even today, the Commission's reports are cited as a model of how to record the inexplicable. The mid-20th century was a time when science felt firmly in command of the facts. After the Second World War, the world placed its faith in expertise, in the microscope, and in the controlled experiment. Every phenomenon was to be measured, reduced to formulas, and, if possible, reproduced. That is why weeping statues became a challenge not only for faith, but for rational thought itself. For if no explanation is found, the assumption is not that a miracle occurred, but that some data are still missing. In 1954, several Italian and French laboratories repeated experiments with plaster reliefs. The goal was simple: to determine whether an ordinary material treated with common household substances could release moisture. For the sake of accuracy, the same types of paints and varnishes used on inexpensive religious souvenirs were employed. The results were unexpected. With temperature fluctuations of just a few degrees and elevated humidity, plaster did indeed sweat. Microscopic capillaries drew moisture to the surface, where it accumulated at points of irregularity, most often in the recesses of the eyes. In a warm room, the moisture evaporated. When the temperature dropped, it reappeared. The scientists published their conclusion. If a statue is kept under uneven environmental conditions, especially against an exterior wall, the weeping effect can occur without any trace of mysticism. For most physicists, the question seemed settled. But for those who had stood before the relief in Syracuse and seen the tears with their own eyes, the explanation felt too dry. Their reply was, yes, physics explains a great deal, but not why it happened in that house, on those days, before those people. Meanwhile, skeptics in Italy grew more active. Rationalist associations published articles with headlines like "Chemistry Against Miracles" and "The Plaster That Cries on Its Own." They pointed to humanity's tendency to perceive signs in coincidences. Physiologists added, "The human eye is structured so that under certain lighting, moist areas appear to move." Add emotional expectation, and a simple reflection becomes a living tear. Yet the story did not end there. In the 1970s, new cases emerged where the substance was not water, but something else: a viscous, fragrant oil. Its chemical composition was more complex. Oils do not evaporate quickly, and in some instances, they did seem to seep from within the material itself, as if from its pores. Skeptics searched for sources, and often found them. A hidden reservoir behind the statue, a syringe connected to the surface. Several exposures ended in scandal, and the church grew more cautious than ever. From then on, every reported case of miraculous tears required an independent investigation. At the same time, psychologists began to focus on the witnesses themselves. The phenomenon of collective perception was explained by the expectation effect. If a group is told they are about to witness a miracle, a significant portion will indeed report unusual changes, even when none occurred. This is how perception works. It fills in the picture according to what is expected. In religious contexts, this mechanism is particularly powerful. It does not make people liars. It makes them witnesses to their own imagination. Still, some cases remained without convincing physical explanation. The materials were tested, access restricted, interference ruled out. yet the moisture returned. For such episodes, a new term appeared, an unexplained phenomenon without signs of falsification, a phrase that simultaneously acknowledges the fact and withholds interpretation. Scientists call it honest, believers, evasive, journalists, sensational. In the end, the phenomenon of weeping statues occupies a gray zone between disciplines. Physicists see capillarity and humidity. Psychologists see suggestion and group dynamics. Theologians see a possible sign. And each is right within their own frame of reference. For weeping statues exist not only in the material world, they exist in perception. And perception shapes reality no less than facts do. When the discussion of facts is exhausted, what remains is the reason people turn to miracles in the first place. Feeling. It cannot be measured, yet it is what drives thousands to travel to places where, it is said, stone has wept. This feeling is not about logic. It is about connection, about the attempt to sense that the world is capable of responding. Faith and perception are forever intertwined. For the scientist, the world is made of patterns. For the believer, of meanings. Yet both seek explanation, one in formulas, the other in metaphors. When a person stands before a statue where a single drop gleams, they do not analyze. They experience a moment. And for them, that drop may become a revelation, a sign, an answer to prayer. In the study of perception, there is a term, apophenia, the tendency to see connections and patterns where none exist. It is what makes clouds resemble animals and random stains resemble faces. But there's also an opposite process, when faith transforms coincidence into a sign, giving chaos a sense of order. In this way, weeping statues are a mirror of the human mind. They reveal how deeply we need to believe that someone, somewhere, hears us. The Church approaches such phenomena with caution. For it, the miracle itself is less important than its effect on the soul. That is why Vatican documents contain no definitive statements about the nature of weeping statues. More often, one reads the words, a fact without rational explanation. This is not denial. It is an acknowledgement of the limits of knowledge. The Church knows that faith does not live in a laboratory. Sometimes such events become sites of pilgrimage. People come not so much to see, but to pray. They do not care whether the drop is made of water or protein. What matters is the emotion, the feeling of shared sorrow, of tears that seem to fall for everyone. The weeping Madonna becomes an image of collective grief, a reminder that even the sacred can suffer. Philosophers see in this a deep archetype, a stone that weeps, the union of opposites, the lifeless showing life, the solid revealing softness, the silent speaking. It strikes a chord because human beings themselves exist on that border, between body and spirit, faith and doubt, matter and emotion. Psychologists add that such symbols serve as collective therapy. People project their pain onto them, finding comfort and release. It does not matter where the tears come from. What matters is that they allow people to let their own tears fall. In this sense, the phenomenon of weeping statues fulfills an ancient function of art and religion. It becomes a catalyst for emotion. From a cultural perspective, one can see something else as well. The miracle as a form of communication. When a society loses faith in reason, miracles return as a dialogue between belief and fear. They remind us that a human being cannot be reduced to numbers, that every era has its own tears, and perhaps That is why such phenomena arise precisely when people most need to feel hope. In that light, the question, are the tears real, loses its meaning. What matters is what they signify. The reality of the experience becomes as important as the reality of the fact. Weeping statues become symbols of a universal human need to be seen by the world, to feel an answer. And if for someone that answer comes in the shimmer of a drop on a marble cheek, who has the right to call it false? More than 70 years have passed since the day a plaster face first wept inside an Italian home. Since then, similar stories have resurfaced dozens of times. In Mexico, Argentina, India, Poland, even in modern cities where people are more accustomed to trusting screens than their own eyes. In some places, traces of fraud were uncovered. In others, laboratories simply shrugged. And still, every time a new report of a weeping statue appears, people gather around it. Because a miracle, even a doubtful one, is still stronger than indifference. We can argue for hours about physics, about capillaries, about the chemical makeup of the drops. We can reassure ourselves that everything in the world is explainable, that mystery is only a lack of data. But sometimes, mystery is needed for its own sake, to remind us that reality still has cracks through which light can enter. Weeping statues are not mere religious curiosities. They are mirrors of who we are. We are beings who search for meaning in every drop, who can pause and watch as a transparent trail slides from the eye of a stone figure. We want to explain, and at the same time, we don't. Because in that drop, something greater is reflected than plaster or water. It reflects our own longing for someone, even for an instant, to share our pain. Think about it. Perhaps a miracle is not what breaks the laws of nature. Perhaps a miracle is when a person, despite all skepticism, can still feel. When, in a noisy world full of screens and headlines, someone stops before a statue and whispers, "I see." And even if that drop turns out to be nothing more than moisture, the very act of looking for meaning in it is already a kind of miracle. Every era seeks its own tears, its own signs. And maybe we should not be so focused on proving miracles, but on learning to notice the small responses that surround us. The unexplainable is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is an invitation to pause, to think, to ask ourselves what we truly believe and what we truly feel. Thus ends our story of the weeping statues, a phenomenon where science meets faith and stone suddenly comes alive. But perhaps the answer lies not in experiments, nor in church commissions. Perhaps the answer lies in you, in whether you can see tears even when none are expected. If this atmosphere speaks to you, subscribe. Here, we explore mysteries where fact and faith walk side by side, stories that make you think, miracles that may live closer than they appear. Support the channel so new stories don't fade into the noise. The next one is already in the works. And who knows, maybe it will make you look at the world just a little more closely.